Well, Juan, thank you for joining me on another version of my podcast where I get to share some of my great new friends with my audience and our journey together in putting together your roadmap. So, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jack. I'm excited to be here.
So, Juan, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, like who you are, uh, how you grew up, anything you think would be good for us to know about you.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. It's a small island in the Caribbean that's part of the U.S. and that in itself was an interesting and unique place to grow up. I grew up playing sports. My father is a prominent volleyball coach down in the island. So I grew up playing lots of volleyball, and then I transitioned over to American football, which was the unlikeliest jump. So I ended up playing Division One college football, which was interesting and fun. I have a younger sister, uh, and overall grew up in a very fun and loving family. So I had a great childhood and a great upbringing.
Wonderful. So, you were quite an athlete, and so was your dad, huh? Or so is your
Yeah.
dad.
Yes. Yeah. I so he started. I mean, he started playing volleyball late, but in only a few years he went pro, and so he played professionally for 15 years, and then he became a coach. And he was the coach for our high school, right? So being the coach's son isn't always the easiest or the most fun role in the team. But that was my case, and so that was interesting, and I learned a lot from that. But a fun fact about him: he coached at the school for something like 37 years. And he basically trained all the students from scratch, so no scholarships, no nothing. And his winning record, he would write down the results of every game for 37 years, and his winning record is something like over 3,000 wins and like 200 and something or 300 losses. So
Wow, that's
it's a
great.
complete it's a complete statistical aberration. So in my background, I always grew up with those teams of competing and winning and being the best, and really working hard.
Now, you also had academic interests, right? Like what did you like to do in school? What did you like to learn?
So it's interesting. When I was very young, I grew up in my grandparents' house, and my maternal grandparent was kind of a Renaissance man type of person. He was a doctor. He flew planes. He had boats. He could cook. He had all kinds of medical books and interesting trinkets and things at his house. So I grew up, surrounded by interesting things. So I've always been very curious. In school, I was I was particularly good at history and the social sciences, and also in biology specifically. But in general, very curious and very interested in just learning everything about everything. Right. So
Yes.
my library grows exponentially, which is becoming a problem. uh,
Yes. Curiosity is a main feature of your personality, isn't it? The desire to learn.
100%.
Yeah. So, what did you go into by way of a career? And how did you get started in it?
So, having the background of my grandfather being a doctor and being good at science, that was kind of always in the background. But the school I went to, a lot of my friends' parents were business people, so they owned their own businesses and they were successful people. And early on, being a sports coach is great, and it's a rewarding career where you get to influence a lot of people. But I always saw the financial struggles, right, and how difficult it is to really earn a good living doing that work. My dad always had three jobs growing up, so this man's working literally 18, 20 hours a day for long periods. And I was always curious and interested in seeing these families that have not material wealth. I wasn't interested in the cars or the mansions or anything like that, but the freedom to go about and not have to slave away so much. And so I started asking a lot of them, like, hey, how do I get in your field? What is business? How, you know what does that, how do I get into that? And a lot of them came back to me and said, look, you need to really understand finance and investing, and international finance at that. And then, if you combine that with law school, you're basically going to run the gamut. You're going to be able to do a lot of things, and you're going to know more than a lot of people. And so that was interesting advice. And I guess, without really using that as a specific guiding light, I ended up doing all of that, and my career even took me down that path. So that was an interesting source of
So you got a
career advice.
you got a law degree and you majored in finance.
So I majored in finance. I majored in international business, but it was heavily concentrated in finance. And then I also studied political science in college. And then I followed that up with a law degree. I graduated college in 2012, and so a lot of the finance jobs that I was interested in basically had disappeared after 08, 09. And so it took the industry quite a while to recover. And my uncle's a lawyer in Puerto Rico, and he said, "Look, come down to Puerto Rico. It's an ABA accredited school, great school. All your teachers, would have gone to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and whatnot. And it's $5,000 a year for a law degree." And I said, "Well, that sounds like a bargain. Let's go do it." And so I went back home and I did that, which was in itself a super interesting academic experience.
So, Juan, what prompted you to be interested in contacting me?
So I'm not sure I told you about this, but I actually heard about you years ago, and I read your book. It must have been 5 or 6 years ago, and I first heard your name from Monish Pabrai, in a podcast that I heard a long time ago. But this year I was actually on a trip on vacation for a wedding in Italy, of all places, and I'm very allergic, so I fell sick, and I'm sitting in the hotel room for a couple of days, just unable to get out of bed, being sick. And I was listening to podcasts, and I heard Monish mention you again, and I said, you know what? I think it's time I call Jack Skeen and I go through this roadmap process. I've been in an interesting juncture professionally for a while now, and I thought it was the right time to get in touch.
Was it a hard decision to make?
It was not.
It was relatively expensive. It is relatively expensive, though, right?
It is.
You're not a guy who just throws away money, are you?
No, that's the last thing I do. In this case, look, it's a big investment in myself. It was a big investment in myself, and funnily enough, just pulling the trigger, right? Just starting the process and sharing that with my family started yielding results immediately through really deep conversations with for example, with my father or my sister, who's a PhD in psychology, about why the hell are you doing this, or why are you spending so much money on this? Like, you know yourself very well. And so that took us in a journey of having various very deep and honest conversations that I felt paid for the entire process before it even started. So thinking risk and reward and return, I think I got well my money's worth.
So you're a bright, insightful man, and yet you learned some things in this process that have been helpful to you.
Very.
Do you mind sharing any come to mind that you would mind sharing with our audience?
Sure. So as you said, I mean, I read a lot, and I'm very introspective, and I've done many rounds of therapy, and so I feel like I'm generally a pretty self-aware person. But going through this process really, and using your insights and your guidance combined with the tests that we did yielded some super interesting results that uh, really, I think, not discovered, but shed some light into the operating system or the software that's
Mhm.
behind the scenes that runs Juan, right? And
Oh,
so
yeah.
a lot of the things that or a lot of decisions that I've made in my life, or a lot of the outcomes that have happened in my life, really started making sense when looked through the lens of some of my core wiring or personality traits. Um, and one of those personality traits is masochism,
Ah,
and and I forget how extreme that uh, that marker came up with, but basically, sometimes in certain situations it may predispose me to shoot myself in the foot, basically, or engage in self-sabotage, and so just knowing that it's going to give me a huge advantage going forward, because I know exactly how it feels when I'm about to do it, and I know exactly the thoughts that come up when I'm entering the self-sabotage zone, right? So that protective measure, just having those guardrails in place, is going to be fantastic going forward.
so just to help the audience understand that aspect, masochism is really about people who tend to get caught up in the process and they forget about the goal line. And so they might be doing all the right things, but not getting where they want to go and not realizing that they're the ones who are creating that problem. And so it's easy to confuse process with progress. And you can have that tendency partly because you just love learning so much. And so you could get caught up in the excitement of learning things, but not realize that maybe you're making a lot of money for other people when you could be making a lot of money for yourself and not even realize that or
Right.
do anything about it.
And it's funny because you start to rationalize things, and you start coming up with explanations that really suit yourself. So one of the examples that I can think of to illustrate that is, I always say, the joy, or the joy is in the process, or the success is in the process, not necessarily the outcome. So
Yeah.
I've convinced myself that I enjoy finding great investments, or just learning, or just doing research, and leaving it at that. And so that gives you some psychological comfort that it may protect you from certain things, but you're basically running in a certain way, you're basically running in place. And
Right. And actually, people were taking advantage of that in you, weren't they? Maybe unconsciously so. But finding
yeah,
you, yes, you were very helpful in helping them create the wealth that you could have been creating for yourself.
to some extent, yeah. And I think, look, when you have that, I think that oozes out of you, right? And so
Yes.
when you look at things just as an academic uh, exercise in the world of investing and finance, especially in high performance places, it comes across as, maybe you don't have conviction, or you don't really believe in your ideas, or maybe you just don't care enough, right? And so immediately those ideas start getting discounted, even if if they're good, or even if they end up working fabulously well. So
So, Juan, insight is a wonderful thing, and seeing more clearly is very helpful. But did the roadmap process get you moving to, like, did it get you doing something to get you where you wanted to go, in addition to giving you insight?
absolutely, I think it was the kick in the butt that I needed, to put it mildly. I thought it was a very profound and insightful process. At times, you feel like you have a freight train running over you, right? Because these truths are coming up, and they're staring at you in the face, and you have to have an honest assessment of yourself and say, hey, you have to accept those things. Uh, but yeah, I mean, action, I think, is, it's the biggest opportunity for me, and also the biggest thing that has held me back. If you look in my career, a lot of the mistakes I've made have been mistakes of omission instead
Mm,
of commission.
yes.
And so starting to take action in the sense of, trusting my gut and my analysis and when making investments is a big step forward. Potentially starting a firm as well is another uh, massive action that's in the cards. And so I think, when we circle back to the work that we did, if we had to summarize it in one word, it's action. Action is the recipe.
So, the idea of a roadmap, at least in my mind, is you might feel stuck in some way. Like, I think there's just some other place I should be, or some other thing I ought to be doing, or something's missing. And if I could help you figure out what that destination is and then create the roadmap to actually get there, then you can begin the journey, can't you?
Absolutely. It all starts with knowing yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Um, it, is this something you think most people would benefit from?
100%. It's funny, after finishing the process, as I interact with people, of course, I'm I'm thinking through all the different categories of personality profiles and things, uh, to not to diagnose people, but kind of to understand, what their wiring may be, and trying to understand maybe why they're making certain decisions. And
Yep.
you kind of, when you step back, you kind of see it clear as day. And you start to wonder why. I've been running blind for
Yeah.
so many years, and now I really know, what drives me and what moves me, and what motivates me, and a lot of different things. So I think it's fundamental for everyone to do this. It doesn't matter if you're in business or in sports or in healthcare or any field. Charlie Munger has a quote. It's about probability, but it applies here. I think he said something like, if you're ignorant of probability, you're going through life like a one-legged man in an ass kicking contest. And so and so the same applies here. If you don't know yourself, you're going through life blind. And so I highly, highly recommend everyone and anyone who has the resources and the means and the time to go through the process, to do it. It takes courage. It was painful at times. It may send you into a small tailspin, but that's real growth, in my opinion. And so,
So Juan, it's a personal thing for me. I get to know you, and you almost become a friend because I get to know you quite well. And I take that as an honor. I appreciate your trust in me, and I hold that trust very dearly. So I hope we stay connected, and I wish you the very best. And thank you for being on the podcast today.
absolutely, Jack. Thanks for the opportunity. Like I've told you a few times, it was an absolute blessing, to get to meet you and go through this process. And I look forward to staying in touch, and keeping you updated, on how life goes from here.
Thank you.
Thanks again.